The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the suburban neighborhood where Jake and Emily Matthews lived. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. A beautiful home, a successful career, and a marriage that everyone admired. Emily, with her impeccable style and charming demeanor, was often the envy of their friends. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her smile, and Jake felt lucky every day to have her by his side. Jake was a hard-working man, often pulling late nights at the office to ensure their comfortable lifestyle. He was in finance, and the long hours and constant pressure were something he'd grown used to over the years. Emily, on the other hand, had a more flexible schedule. She was a freelance graphic designer, which allowed her to work from home or from one of the many chic coffee shops she frequented. It was an arrangement that worked well for them, or so Jake thought. Their evenings together were always filled with the usual routines: dinner, a glass of wine, and perhaps a movie or some light conversation. But lately Jake had noticed a subtle shift in Emily's behavior. She seemed a bit distant, her phone always by her side, and she was more secretive than usual. He dismissed it, chalking it up to stress, or perhaps some new project she was working on. After all, Emily was the epitome of loyalty and love, the very picture of a devoted wife. Or so he believed. One Friday evening, Jake's best friend Tom called him up, suggesting they grab a drink. Tom was the kind of guy who always had a story to tell, and tonight was no different. As they sat in their usual booth at the bar, Tom's expression was unusually serious. Jake noticed but didn't press. Tom would talk when he was ready. "Jake, I've got something I need to ask you," Tom finally said, after a few rounds. Jake, slightly puzzled, nodded for him to go on. "Has Emily been acting strange lately? You know, like keeping things from you?" Jake chuckled, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his gut. "Strange? No, not really. Why?" Tom hesitated, his gaze fixed on the drink in his hand. "I don't want to alarm you, man, but I came across something the other day. Something that doesn't sit right with me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Tom was never one to beat around the bush, but this time he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. "What are you talking about, Tom?" Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I was messing around online, just seeing what's out there. I wasn't actually planning to do anything, just curious, I guess. Anyway, I came across a profile, and, Jake, it looked a lot like Emily." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, a profile?" Tom hesitated again before pulling out his phone. He fumbled with it for a moment before handing it over to Jake. On the screen was a website, one of those shady escort services that Jake had only heard about in passing, and there, staring back at him, was a photo that looked disturbingly similar to his wife. "Tom, this is crazy. Emily would never," Jake started, but his voice faltered. I know. That's what I thought too," Tom interrupted. "But look at the details, Jake. The way she's described. It matches Emily. And the photo. I mean, it's not just some look-alike. It's her." Jake's mind was reeling. This had to be some kind of mistake. A sick joke. Emily, his Emily, involved in something like this? It was impossible. But as much as Jake wanted to dismiss it, there was a nagging doubt now lodged in his mind. He stared at the screen, his thoughts a chaotic mess. Tom's voice broke through the fog. "I didn't want to believe it either, Jake. But you need to find out for sure." Jake couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he handed the phone back to Tom, forcing a laugh. "This is crazy, Tom. There's got to be some explanation. Emily would never do something like this." Tom nodded, though his expression remained grave. "Yeah, man. I hope you're right." As they parted ways that night, Jake couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He told himself it was nothing, that Tom was just overreacting. But as he drove home, the image on that screen haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind. When he walked through the door, Emily was already in bed, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. Jake stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. It was hard to reconcile the woman lying there with the image that had been burned into his mind. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He would talk to her about it tomorrow, he decided. But for now, he just needed to sleep. Everything would make sense in the morning, or so he hoped. As he slipped into bed beside her, Jake couldn't help but wonder if his perfect life was beginning to crack at the edges. And if it was, how deep did those cracks run? The next morning, Jake woke up with a lingering sense of unease. The conversation with Tom from the night before played over and over in his mind like a bad dream he could not shake. As he turned to look at Emily, still asleep beside him, he felt a pang of guilt for even entertaining the idea that she could be involved in something so sordid. But that doubt, once planted, was hard to ignore. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she smiled at him. "Morning, honey," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. Jake forced a smile. "Morning." She leaned over to kiss him, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But as she pulled away and got out of bed, Jake found himself scrutinizing her every move, looking for signs, clues, anything that might confirm or deny the nagging suspicion in his mind. Emily went about her morning routine as usual, humming softly as she made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Jake followed her, trying to shake off the paranoia that had settled in his chest. "Anything on your mind?" Emily asked as she poured him a cup of coffee. Jake hesitated. He had planned to confront her, to ask her outright about the profile Tom had shown him. But now, in the light of day, the idea seemed ridiculous. What if it really was just a coincidence? What if he accused her of something so horrible, and it turned out to be nothing? He could not bring himself to do it. Not yet. "Nah, just thinking about work," he lied, taking a sip of his coffee. Emily smiled, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside him. "You've been working too hard, Jake. Maybe we should take a weekend off. Go somewhere nice, just the two of us." Jake nodded absently, the idea of a getaway suddenly feeling more like an escape. "Yeah, that sounds good." The rest of the day passed in a blur of normalcy. Jake went through the motions, trying to keep his doubts at bay. But every time he looked at Emily, that nagging voice in the back of his mind grew louder. He found himself replaying the conversation with Tom, wondering if there was any truth to what he had seen. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Jake found himself alone in the living room, staring at his phone. He hesitated for a long moment before finally giving in to the urge that had been eating at him all day. He typed the website's address into his browser, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched for the profile Tom had shown him. It took him a few minutes to find it, but when he did, his stomach dropped. There she was. The same photo, the same description. It was her. Or at least, it looked exactly like her. The woman in the photo was dressed provocatively, her face partially obscured. But Jake could not shake the feeling that it was Emily. The similarities were too striking to ignore. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Could it really be her? Was his wife leading a double life? Selling herself to strangers while he was none the wiser? The idea was too surreal to comprehend, but the evidence was right there in front of him. Jake's first instinct was to confront Emily, to wake her up and demand answers. But as he sat there, phone in hand, he realized that he needed more proof. If he accused her now, without concrete evidence, she could easily deny it. And then what? Their marriage would be damaged, perhaps beyond repair, and he would be left with nothing but doubts. No, he needed to be sure. The next day, Jake began to pay closer attention to Emily's behavior. He noticed the way she would disappear for hours at a time, always with a vague excuse about work or meeting a friend. He started checking her phone when she was not looking, scanning her messages and call history for anything suspicious. But Emily was careful. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that gave him any reason to suspect her. If she was hiding something, she was doing a damn good job of it. A few days later, Tom called again. Jake was hesitant to answer, still grappling with the implications of what he had discovered. But he needed someone to talk to, someone who knew what he was going through. "Hey, Jake." Tom's voice was cautious, as if he knew his friend was on edge. "I've been thinking about what we talked about." Jake sighed, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, so have I. Listen, I know this is hard to believe, but you need to find out the truth. You can't keep living like this, man." "I know," Jake muttered. "But how? How do I prove it?" Tom was silent for a moment, then spoke with a hint of reluctance. "There's a way, but you're not going to like it." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Tom hesitated. "You could hire someone to, See if she's actually doing this, like a private investigator. The idea made Jake's stomach turn. Spying on his own wife? It felt wrong on so many levels. But what choice did he have? He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I don't know, Tom. Jake, think about it. If it turns out to be nothing, then great. You can move on and forget this ever happened. But if it's true, at least you'll know. Jake sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always trusted Emily, believed in her completely. But now that trust was unraveling, and he needed to find out why. All right, Jake finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll do it. Tom promised to help him find a reputable investigator, someone discreet who could get to the bottom of this without tipping Emily off. As Jake hung up the phone, he felt a mix of dread and determination. He had to know the truth, no matter what it cost him. That night, as he lay in bed beside Emily, he felt a chasm widening between them, a distance that had never been there before. She was still the same woman he had always loved, but now she was also a stranger, someone he did not fully know or understand. And as he drifted off to sleep, Jake knew that the answers he sought could very well destroy the life he had built. But the truth was no longer something he could avoid. It was something he had to face, no matter how dark it might be. The next few days were a blur for Jake. His mind was consumed with questions and suspicions, and every moment he spent around Emily felt like a test. He analyzed her every word, her every gesture, looking for cracks in the facade that he had once believed to be flawless. Yet, despite his efforts, Emily remained as composed and loving as ever, which only made Jake's doubts more suffocating. True to his word, Tom connected Jake with a private investigator named Steve. Steve was an unassuming man in his mid-40s with a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. When Jake first met him at a small cafe in the city, he felt a wave of guilt. He was about to turn the spotlight on his own wife, a woman he had promised to love and protect. But the need for answers outweighed his moral reservations. "Mr. Matthews," Steve began, his voice calm and professional, "I understand this is a difficult situation. My job is to provide you with the facts, nothing more, nothing less. I need you to be clear about what you want me to investigate." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his decision. "I need to know if my wife is involved in something that would explain the doubts I've been having. I don't want to believe it's true, but if there's anything going on, I need to know." Steve nodded, taking notes as Jake described what Tom had shown him and the strange behaviors he had noticed in Emily. "I'll begin by tracking her movements, looking into any unusual activity. This will take some time, so I'll need you to be patient. It's important that she doesn't suspect anything." Jake agreed, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten as Steve laid out his plan. He felt a pang of guilt as he signed the contract, officially setting the wheels in motion for what could be the end of his marriage. Over the next week, Jake tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He went to work, engaged in the usual small talk with his colleagues, and came home to Emily every evening. But the tension between them was palpable, at least on Jake's end. He found himself withdrawing, emotionally shutting down as he waited for Steve to uncover the truth. Emily noticed the change in him but didn't push too hard. She would ask if everything was okay, and Jake would give her the same hollow assurances that it was just work stress. But deep down, he knew she sensed that something was off. One evening, Emily suggested they go out to dinner. "We haven't had a date night in a while, and I think it would be good for us," she said with a hopeful smile. Jake hesitated but ultimately agreed. He knew he needed to keep up appearances, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. They went to one of their favorite restaurants, a cozy Italian place where they had celebrated anniversaries and special occasions. But tonight the ambiance felt different, tense, strained. As they sat across from each other, Emily reached out and took Jake's hand. "Jake, I know you've been stressed, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. We're a team, remember?" Jake forced a smile, squeezing her hand in return. "I know, Em. I appreciate that." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. The doubt had driven a wedge between them, and no amount of reassurances could bridge the gap that was growing wider with each passing day. The next morning, Jake received a call from Steve. His heart pounded as he answered, bracing himself for whatever news the investigator had uncovered. "Mr. Matthews." Steve's voice was as steady as ever, but there was a tension there that Jake hadn't heard before. "I've been following your wife's movements, and I've found some things that you need to be aware of. It's not conclusive yet, but it's concerning." Jake's breath caught in his throat. "What did you find?" Steve hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's been meeting with someone, a man, on a regular basis. I've traced her to a few locations that are known for, let's say, discrete transactions. I can't say for certain what's happening, but it's suspicious enough that I thought you should know." Jake felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. The image of Emily, his loving wife, involved in something so sordid was almost too much to bear. But he needed to know for sure, to see it with his own eyes. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to continue my surveillance," Steve replied. "If there's something more going on, I'll find it. In the meantime, I suggest you keep things as normal as possible on your end. We don't want to tip her off." Jake agreed, though the thought of pretending everything was fine made his skin crawl. As he hung up the phone, he realized just how deep he was in. This was no longer just a doubt or a suspicion. It was a full-blown investigation into the life of the woman he thought he knew. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the storm brewing in his personal life. But every time his phone buzzed, his heart would race, fearing it was Steve with more damning evidence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake received another call from Steve. This time, the investigator's tone was more serious, more urgent. "Mr. Matthews, I've got something you need to see. I think it's time we meet in person." Jake's stomach churned as he agreed to meet Steve later that evening. The drive to the agreed location felt like it took hours, even though it was only across town. When Jake arrived, Steve was waiting in his car, a folder in his lap. Jake got into the passenger seat, his hands shaking slightly. "What did you find?" Steve handed him the folder, his expression grim. "I think you should see for yourself." With trembling hands, Jake opened the folder and began to sift through the photos inside. They were grainy, taken from a distance. But there was no mistaking the woman in them. It was Emily, meeting with a man Jake didn't recognize, entering a building that Steve had identified as a high-end hotel. The timestamps on the photos showed that these meetings were frequent, always during the day when Jake was at work. Jake's world shattered as he flipped through the evidence, each image driving the knife deeper into his heart. He had hoped, prayed even, that this was all a mistake. But now, with the proof staring him in the face, there was no denying the truth. Emily was living a double life, and Jake was no longer sure he knew who she really was. The woman he had married, the woman he had loved and trusted, was a stranger. And as the reality of the situation sank in, Jake realized that the life he had built was crumbling around him, piece by piece. But the worst part was yet to come. The true extent of Emily's betrayal, the full scope of her deception, was still hidden from Jake's view. And when it finally came to light, it would change everything, forever. Jake sat in Steve's car, the weight of the folder on his lap feeling like a lead anchor pulling him down into an abyss. The photos were damning, there was no denying that. But it was the context, the implications that shook him to his core. Emily had been lying to him, leading a life he knew nothing about. And now, faced with the evidence, he was at a loss for how to even begin processing it. Steve cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I know this is a lot to take in, Mr. Matthews, but I want to remind you that we still don't have the full picture. There's more to investigate, more to uncover. If you want me to keep digging, I will. But it's your call." Jake stared at the photos, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to confront Emily, to demand answers, but the rational part of him knew that he needed more. He needed the whole truth before he acted. The thought of Emily continuing to deceive him, of living in this nightmare for even one more day, made his skin crawl. But what choice did he have? If he confronted her now, she could deny everything, spin the situation in her favor. He needed to be sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt. "Keep digging, Steve," Jake finally said, his voice hollow. "I need to know everything." Steve nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I'll keep you updated. In the meantime, try to act normal." Don't let her suspect anything. Jake left the meeting feeling like a ghost, disconnected from reality. He drove home in a daze, the familiar streets of his neighborhood now seeming alien and foreboding. When he walked through the door, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, the smell of roasting chicken wafting through the air. "Hey, honey," she called out, her voice cheerful, oblivious to the storm raging inside Jake. "Dinner's almost ready." Jake forced a smile, the mask of normalcy slipping into place. "Sounds great," he replied, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. He went through the motions that evening, sitting down to eat, making small talk, pretending that everything was fine. But every time he looked at Emily, all he could see were the photos, the evidence of her betrayal. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger, someone he no longer knew, and it took every ounce of strength he had to keep up the charade. After dinner, Emily suggested they watch a movie, something light and funny to unwind after the day. Jake agreed, though his mind was elsewhere. As they sat on the couch, Emily snuggled up next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. Jake felt a pang of sorrow, a deep, aching sadness that this woman, who he had once loved so deeply, had become someone he could no longer trust. Halfway through the movie, Emily's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it quickly, her expression unreadable, before turning the screen face down. Jake's heart skipped a beat, the suspicion flaring up once more. "Who was that?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Emily smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "Oh, just a friend from work. Nothing important." Jake nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. He wanted to reach for the phone, to see who she was really talking to, but he knew that would blow his cover. Instead, he swallowed his anger and kept his focus on the movie, though he could not remember a single scene afterward. That night, as Emily slept beside him, Jake lay awake, his mind spinning with questions and doubts. He thought about the man in the photos, the hotel, the secret life Emily had been leading. Who was she meeting? Why was she doing this? The Emily he knew would never get involved in something so sordid, so dangerous. But then again, did he really know her at all? Days turned into weeks, and Jake continued to live in a state of constant tension. Steve provided updates regularly, each one more damning than the last. Emily was meeting with different men, always at the same hotel, always during the day when Jake was at work. The details of her double life were slowly coming into focus, but the full picture was still elusive. Jake felt like he was losing his mind. The woman he had married was a stranger, and the life he thought they shared was unraveling before his eyes. Every time Emily kissed him, touched him, whispered sweet nothings in his ear, it felt like a betrayal. And yet, he could not confront her, not until he had all the facts. Finally, one evening, Steve called with news that shattered whatever illusions Jake had left. "Mr. Matthews, I've found something that you need to see. This might be the final piece of the puzzle." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it?" "It's a video," Steve said, his voice grave. "I followed your wife today, and she met with a client. I managed to get some footage. It's pretty clear what's going on." Jake felt like he was going to be sick. The thought of watching a video of Emily with another man, of seeing her betrayal firsthand, made his stomach churn. But he knew he had to see it, to confront the truth head on, no matter how painful. "Send it to me," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Steve agreed, and a few minutes later, Jake received a link to a private video. His hands trembled as he clicked on it, the screen filling with the grainy footage. It was hard to watch. Emily entering a hotel room, a man following her inside, the door closing behind them. The audio was muffled, but the implication was clear. The video cut to another shot, this time from a distance, through a crack in the door. Jake saw Emily, his wife, undressing in front of the man, who handed her a stack of cash before they disappeared into the room's shadows. Jake's world collapsed as he watched the video. This was no longer a suspicion, no longer a doubt. It was real. Emily was a prostitute, selling herself to strangers while pretending to be the loving wife he thought he knew. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that Jake felt like he could not breathe. He shut off the video, his mind numb. For a long time he just sat there, staring at the blank screen, trying to process what he had seen. The life he had known, the marriage he had cherished, was over. There was no coming back from this. But as the initial shock began to wear off, something else took its place. Anger. A deep, burning rage that consumed him. Emily had not just betrayed him. She had destroyed him, torn apart the life they had built together. And now, all Jake could think about was how to make her pay. The time for pretending was over. The time for revenge had begun. The days following the revelation were a blur of raw emotion for Jake. The anger that had started as a simmer quickly grew into a boiling rage that consumed his every thought. He could hardly look at Emily without his blood boiling, yet he forced himself to play the part of the clueless husband, biding his time until he could unleash the storm he was planning. Each morning, Jake would go through the motions, getting ready for work, kissing Emily goodbye, pretending that everything was fine. But behind his calm facade, he was plotting. He had already decided that Emily needed to be confronted, but he wanted to do it in a way that would leave her with no room to lie, no opportunity to worm her way out of the truth. Steve continued to send updates, each one more damning than the last. Jake kept a detailed file of everything: the photos, the video, the times and places of Emily's meetings. He wanted to have it all laid out, undeniable and irrefutable, when the time came to confront her. But that wasn't enough. Jake needed her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to understand the full extent of the pain she had caused, and for that, he needed to plan something more. Finally, after days of careful preparation, Jake was ready. He arranged for the confrontation to take place at their home, the very place where Emily had lied to him, where she had pretended to be the loving wife while living a double life. He knew it would be the perfect setting for what he had in mind. It was a Friday evening, and Jake had suggested they have a quiet night in. Emily, oblivious to what was coming, had agreed. She seemed happy, even relieved, that Jake was finally relaxing after what she believed was just work-related stress. After dinner, Jake casually mentioned that he had something to show her. "It's a little project I've been working on," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Emily looked intrigued, but unsuspecting as Jake led her into the living room, where he had set up his laptop. He gestured for her to sit down on the couch while he took a seat next to her. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice light and curious. Jake hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. But then he remembered the video, the photos, the lies, and the anger surged back, stronger than ever. "It's something I think you need to see," Jake said, his tone suddenly serious. Emily's smile faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes as Jake opened the laptop and clicked on the file that Steve had sent him. The video began to play, and Jake watched as Emily's expression shifted from curiosity to shock, then to horror, as she realized what she was seeing. "Jake, what is this?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "You tell me, Emily," Jake replied coldly, his eyes locked on hers. "You seem to know this hotel pretty well." Emily's face drained of color as she watched the grainy footage of herself with another man, taking the money, undressing. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The guilt and fear were written all over her face, and for the first time, Jake saw her for what she really was: a liar, a deceiver, someone who had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. "Jake, I can explain," Emily finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "Explain?" Jake's voice was low, almost a growl. "Explain how my wife, the woman I've loved and trusted for years, has been sneaking around behind my back, selling herself to strangers. How you've been living a double life while pretending everything was fine." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but Jake felt no sympathy, only cold, seething anger. "It's not what you think," she whispered, reaching out to him, but Jake recoiled as if her touch burned him. "Don't you dare try to play the victim here," Jake snapped. "I've seen the evidence, Emily. The photos, the videos, all of it. There's no lying your way out of this." Emily collapsed into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. "Jake, please. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop. It just happened." "Just happened?" Jake echoed, incredulous. "That's your excuse? You didn't know how to stop? You didn't want to hurt me? Do you have any idea what you've done, how you've destroyed everything?" Emily tried to speak, but Jake cut her off, his voice icy and controlled. "You don't get to cry your way out of this, Emily. You've lied to me for who knows how long. You've betrayed me, betrayed our marriage, and now you want me to just forgive you because you're sorry? Because you didn't mean to?" Emily was sobbing harder now, But Jake felt nothing but a deep, empty void where his love for her used to be. "You don't deserve forgiveness, Emily. You don't deserve anything from me." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of desperation. "Jake, please." "I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll quit. I'll—" "Quit?" Jake interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Quit what, Emily? Your job as a prostitute? Or is it just another hobby for you, something you do for fun?" Emily flinched as if he had slapped her. "Jake, please, I love you. I was lost. I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry. Please don't leave me." Jake stared at her, his anger slowly giving way to a cold, calculating resolve. "Oh, I'm leaving, Emily. But not before you feel the full consequences of what you've done." Emily looked at him, wide-eyed with fear. "What do you mean?" Jake leaned in close, his voice a whisper now, dripping with venom. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are. Your friends, your family, our neighbors. They're all going to know the truth, and when I'm done, you won't have anything left. No job, no reputation, nothing." Emily's face twisted in horror, her tears flowing even harder. "Jake, no, please. Don't do this. I'll lose everything." "You already have," Jake said coldly. "You just don't realize it yet." He stood up, looking down at her one last time. "I'll be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. Don't be here when I get back." With that, Jake turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily sobbing on the couch. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The confrontation was over, but the revenge had only just begun. The weekend passed in a haze for Jake. He spent most of it out of the house, unable to bear being under the same roof as Emily. The few times he did return, it was only to grab essentials, each time finding Emily still in the house, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She had tried to talk to him, to beg and plead, but Jake had shut her down every time. There was nothing left to say. Monday morning came, and with it, the first steps toward ending the life Jake had once cherished. He arrived at the lawyer's office early, his resolve steely as he signed the divorce papers. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, assured him that they would move quickly and efficiently. She had seen cases like this before, and Jake could tell from her demeanor that she knew exactly how to handle it. As Jake left the office, a strange sense of relief settled over him. The process had begun, and soon, Emily would be nothing more than a painful memory. But his resolve to see her suffer had not waned. If anything, it had only grown stronger. True to his word, Jake began to unravel Emily's life, piece by piece. He started with their closest friends, carefully choosing who to tell first. He wanted the story to spread slowly, like a poison seeping through their social circle, ensuring that by the time it reached its peak, Emily would have nowhere to turn. Jake arranged a meeting with their mutual friends, inviting them over under the guise of needing support during a tough time. When they arrived, he wasted no time in telling them everything. He laid out the facts, Emily's double life, the evidence he had gathered, the betrayal she had committed. The shock and disbelief on their faces only fueled his resolve. "What are you going to do?" one of their friends, Karen, asked, her voice filled with concern. "I've already filed for divorce," Jake replied, his tone flat. "But that's just the beginning. She's going to pay for what she's done." There were murmurs of agreement, but also looks of pity. Jake didn't care. He had been pitied enough already. Now it was Emily's turn to face the consequences. Next, Jake turned his attention to Emily's family. He knew how much they meant to her, how much she prided herself on being the perfect daughter, the one who had it all together. He called her parents, arranging a meeting under the pretense of needing to discuss something important. When they arrived at the small cafe Jake had chosen, they seemed nervous, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Jake, what's going on?" Emily's mother asked, her voice tinged with worry. Jake took a deep breath, then began to tell them everything. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to soften the blow. He wanted them to feel the full impact of what their daughter had done, to understand the depth of her betrayal. As he spoke, Emily's mother's face grew pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her father, usually so composed, clenched his fists in anger. They tried to defend her at first, to say there must be some mistake, but Jake quickly shut them down by showing them the evidence. "This is who she really is," Jake said, his voice cold. "She lied to all of us." By the time he finished, Emily's parents were in shock. Her mother was crying, and her father looked like he was ready to explode with rage. Jake felt a grim satisfaction watching them realize that their daughter wasn't the perfect person they believed her to be. "We'll talk to her," Emily's father said, his voice shaking. "We'll get her the help she needs." "Do whatever you want," Jake replied, standing up to leave. "But she's not my problem anymore." He walked out of the cafe without looking back, knowing that he had just delivered a devastating blow to Emily's world. The final piece of Jake's plan was to expose Emily publicly, to ensure that her reputation was shattered beyond repair. He knew this would be the hardest step, the one that would hurt her the most, but he was determined to go through with it. He started by leaking the story to a few gossip sites, using an anonymous account to provide the details of Emily's double life. He included the evidence Steve had gathered, making sure there was no doubt about the authenticity of the claims. Within hours, the story began to spread like wildfire. First locally, then more widely as people caught wind of the scandal. Emily's phone started buzzing incessantly with calls and messages, and Jake watched from a distance as her world crumbled. Friends who had once admired her began to distance themselves, horrified by what they had learned. Her family, who had always supported her, were now too ashamed to show their faces in public. Even her freelance clients began to drop her, unwilling to be associated with someone mired in such a scandal. The fallout was swift and brutal. Emily's life was in ruins, and Jake knew there was no way for her to recover. She was left with nothing. No friends, no family, no career. Just the wreckage of the life she had destroyed. One evening, as Jake sat in the empty house that had once been their home, he received a text message from Emily. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. "Jake, please, I'm begging you. Stop this. I have nothing left. I know I hurt you, but please, don't destroy me completely. I don't know what to do. Please." Jake stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. He had gotten his revenge. Emily was broken, just as she had broken him. But now, as he sat in the silence of the house, he realized that the revenge he had sought hadn't brought him the closure he expected. He typed a reply, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before he hit send. "This is what you deserve." With that, Jake put down his phone and stared out the window, wondering what came next in a life that had been defined by betrayal and revenge. The days following Jake's final message to Emily were filled with a strange, disquieting emptiness. The storm of emotions that had driven him to exact his revenge had finally passed, leaving behind a hollow silence that echoed through every corner of the house. The life he had once known, the future he had envisioned, was now nothing more than a distant memory, tainted by betrayal and shattered trust. Emily had moved out, leaving behind a few boxes of things she hadn't bothered to take with her. Jake avoided the sight of them, as if touching those remnants of their shared life would somehow reawaken the pain he had worked so hard to suppress. He threw himself into his work, staying late at the office, taking on extra projects, anything to avoid the silence that greeted him at home. But despite his efforts, the emptiness lingered, the satisfaction of revenge, the cold comfort of knowing that Emily had paid for her sins, had quickly faded. What remained was a deep sense of loss, a grief for the life he had once cherished. It wasn't just the marriage that had ended, it was the end of an entire chapter of his life, one that he had believed in so wholeheartedly. Jake began to see a therapist, though he was reluctant at first. It had been Tom who had suggested it, pointing out that revenge might have brought him some closure, but it hadn't healed the wounds Emily's betrayal had inflicted. The therapist, a calm and empathetic woman named Dr. Collins, listened as Jake recounted the entire ordeal. How he had discovered Emily's secret, how he had planned and executed his revenge, and how, in the end, it had left him feeling more empty than ever. "You've been through a traumatic experience, Jake," Dr. Collins said gently during one of their sessions. "It's natural to feel a mix of emotions, anger, grief, even regret. Revenge can provide a sense of justice, but it rarely brings true healing." Jake nodded, though he struggled to fully grasp what healing would even look like. "I thought making her suffer would make me feel better, and for a while it did. But now, I don't know, I just feel lost." Dr. Collins leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You've been focused on the pain Emily caused you, which is understandable. But now, it's time to focus on yourself, on what you need to move forward." It's okay to grieve what you've lost, but it's also important to think about what you want your life to look like from here. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't even know where to start. Start with forgiveness, Dr. Collins suggested. Not necessarily forgiveness for Emily. That's something that may or may not come with time. But forgiveness for yourself. Forgive yourself for the anger, the hurt, the decisions you made in the heat of the moment. You're human, Jake. It's okay to have those feelings, but you don't have to let them define you. Jake mulled over her words, letting them sink in. Forgiveness had never crossed his mind. He had been so consumed with the idea of punishing Emily, of making her pay for what she had done, that he hadn't stopped to consider how much of that anger he had been directing at himself. Over the next few weeks, Jake tried to take Dr. Collins' advice to heart. He began to spend more time focusing on his own well-being, reconnecting with friends he had distanced himself from, and even picking up hobbies he had neglected during his marriage. It was not easy. Every step forward felt like an uphill battle, but slowly, he began to reclaim parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. One evening, as he was sorting through some old papers, Jake came across a photo of him and Emily from their early days together. They were smiling, carefree, so full of hope and love. For a moment, he felt a pang of sorrow, a reminder of what they had once had. But instead of the usual rush of anger or regret, Jake found himself feeling something different: acceptance. He stared at the photo, letting the memories wash over him, and then he placed it back in the box with a sense of finality. The past was the past, and while it had shaped him, it did not have to define him. Emily had made her choices, and Jake had made his. Now, it was time to move on, to let go of the bitterness and embrace whatever came next. A few days later, Jake received a letter in the mail. It was from Emily. He hesitated before opening it, unsure if he was ready to hear from her again. But curiosity got the better of him, and he unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The letter was brief, written in a neat, careful script. Jake, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to say this. I'm sorry, truly, deeply sorry for everything I did to you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I hope in time, you can find peace. I've lost everything because of my own choices, and I'm trying to rebuild, to be better. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and I hope you can find happiness again. Jake read the letter twice, letting the words sink in. It didn't bring him the closure he had expected, but it did bring a sense of finality. Emily was no longer the woman who had betrayed him. She was someone who had made mistakes. Someone who was dealing with the consequences of those mistakes, just as he was. He folded the letter and placed it in the box with the photo, a symbolic gesture of putting the past behind him. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully forgive Emily, but he knew that it was time to stop letting her hold power over his life. As Jake stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below, he felt a sense of calm that had been absent for so long. The storm had passed, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was his to walk, free from the shadows of betrayal and revenge. For the first time in months, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. The future was still unwritten, and he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Months had passed since Jake had received Emily's letter, and life had taken on a new rhythm, one that was quieter, more reflective, but also filled with possibilities. The wounds of betrayal had begun to heal, though the scars remained, a reminder of a past that had shaped him in ways he never could have imagined. Jake had sold the house he and Emily had shared, finding it too full of memories, both good and bad. He moved into a smaller place on the other side of town, a modest apartment with a view of the city skyline. It was a fresh start, a blank slate where he could begin to rebuild his life without the ghosts of his past lurking around every corner. He kept in touch with Tom, who had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal. Their friendship had grown stronger, forged in the fire of shared pain and recovery. They met up regularly, grabbing a beer or catching a game, the conversations gradually shifting from the past to the present and future. Jake had also reconnected with some of the friends he had distanced himself from during his marriage. It wasn't easy at first. There were awkward moments, uncomfortable questions, But he found that most people were more understanding than he had expected. They didn't pry too much, respecting his need to move on without dragging everything back up. Slowly, the social circle he had once valued began to reform, though in a different way. Work had become a place of solace for Jake, a space where he could focus on something other than his personal life. His colleagues noticed the change in him. He was more driven, more engaged, and it wasn't long before he was offered a promotion. It wasn't just a reward for his hard work. It was an acknowledgement of the resilience he had shown in the face of personal adversity. Jake accepted the promotion, not just for the career boost, but as a symbol of his own growth and determination to move forward. Despite the progress he had made, there were still moments when the past caught up with him. Flashes of memories, sudden pangs of loss. But each time, Jake reminded himself that he was no longer defined by those moments. He had survived, and now he was learning to thrive. One evening, as Jake was walking through the city after a long day at work, he found himself in front of a small art gallery. He hadn't planned to stop, but something about the vibrant paintings in the window drew him in. Inside, the gallery was quiet, with only a few other visitors meandering through the exhibits. As Jake wandered from piece to piece, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The art spoke to him in a way he hadn't expected, each painting telling a story of resilience, of overcoming adversity, of finding beauty in the chaos of life. It was exactly what he needed at that moment, a reminder that life, like art, was a process of creation, destruction, and renewal. As he was about to leave, Jake noticed a woman standing near the back of the gallery, studying a large abstract piece. She seemed lost in thought, her expression contemplative. There was something about her that intrigued Jake, a quiet strength, a sense of introspection that mirrored his own. He hesitated for a moment, then approached her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the painting. The woman turned to him, her eyes warm and inviting. "It really is," she replied with a smile. "There's something about it that just speaks to you, you know?" Jake nodded, feeling a connection that was both surprising and comforting. "Yeah, I know what you mean." They fell into an easy conversation, talking about the art, the city, and eventually, life itself. Her name was Claire, and she had recently moved to the city after a difficult breakup, searching for a fresh start just like Jake. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people finding solace in each other's company. They exchanged numbers before leaving the gallery, both of them sensing that this was the beginning of something new, something different. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt the stirrings of hope, of possibility. It wasn't about replacing the past, but about building something new, something better. As Jake walked home that evening, he found himself smiling, a real, genuine smile that came from a place of contentment. The journey had been long and painful, filled with twists and turns he hadn't anticipated. But now, as he stood on the brink of a new chapter, Jake knew that he was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side, and now the future was his to shape. And with each step he took, Jake knew that he was finally, truly, moving on.